Viewed the data that came out this morning on CPI, and it was positive relative to expectations. I'm not for cherry picking. I am not going to show up here and say mission accomplished. And what I'd say is there's plenty of work to do.
All right, that was Federal Reserve Chairman Kevin Warsh testifying yesterday before the House Financial Services Committee. His comments coming after the release of a better-than-expected inflation report. Let's bring in former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner, who has charts on yesterday's inflation data and oil prices. And there's a lot to cover.
Yeah, Steve, really quickly, before you get into all of this, Kevin Warsh was a deficit hawk in previous incarnations. Then when President Trump wanted him to come on board, he started sounding more like a dove. But is there reason to believe right now that sort of that hawk that he's always been, a man who understands that the last thing you want is inflation kind of getting out of the barn door? Is that who he is again?
Yeah, I think so, Joe. I think he was very clear in his testimony. And I've been talking to some other Fed officials who say the same thing, which is that basically the Fed remains completely committed to getting back to 2% inflation, which is not nearly where we are at the moment. And that is going to mean higher interest rates, probably not at their meeting in July, but later this year. That's what the market is now expecting. It's flipped from before the war. We thought interest rates were going to keep coming down. Now we think they're going to go up a bit in the course of this year, and the Fed remains committed to 2%. So, yes, I agree with you.
All right, let's go to your charts. The first one looking at inflation and how it's impacting workers, Steve.
Right. So here's the point. We did get a somewhat better than expected inflation reading, as the chairman said yesterday. But to Joe's point, inflation is still running 3.5%. above where it was last year, obviously largely because of oil prices and the war, but nonetheless, that's where it is. The other piece of good news in the number was that wages are also up 3.5%. So essentially, for the first time since the war started, consumers are not losing more ground, but they do remain underwater, so to speak, relative to where they were before the war in terms of purchasing power. Now, obviously, not all consumers are the same. We have obviously people at higher and lower incomes. And so the effect of this is different. And so here's a little data point to show you how it works kind of in the real world. This is a study by the New York Fed on gasoline purchases. And what it shows is that for higher, lower, and middle income people, gasoline purchases have been fairly tight and constant until you had the Iran war started. And then there's been a divergence here where high income Americans have maintained roughly their level of gas purchases. Have essentially absorbed the higher prices, whereas middle and lower income families have had to cut back on their gas purchases. They've had to carpool more, take public transit, or otherwise simply just not use their car quite as much. So an average, but definitely different impacts.
This is the primal scream of a dying regime. Pray for our enemies, because we're going medieval on these people. You're just not got a free shot at all these networks lying about the people. The people have had a belly full of it. I know you don't like hearing that. I know you try to do everything in the world to stop that, but you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen.
And where do people like that go to share the big lie? MAGA media. I wish in my soul, I wish that any of these people had a conscience.
Ask yourself, what is my task and what is my purpose? If that answer is to save my country, this country will be saved.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
It's Saturday, 18 July, year of our Lord, 2026. Welcome to the Saturday edition of the War Room. As you know, my favorite show of the week. We can catch our breath from the grind of the daily news, although we've had some monumental news this week. We haven't had time to go through the economy, the economic news, and particularly direction of where it's headed. You just heard Morning Joe there. They're on Wash, that it used to be a deficit hawk. You know, we have to face a very unpleasant reality, but that's one of the reasons for the War Room, is to face unpleasant realities, and that is the balance sheet of the United States. Right now, we have a balance sheet that has exploded. Now, President Trump had this under control, and then pandemic, I think we had three. And if we could pull that from my getter, I have a chart up there of just deficits we've run. I think the $3.1 trillion because the massive drop in aggregate demand during the Chinese-induced pandemic, and we got to start talking about reparations from the Chinese to make us whole there. After that, the deficits have never come down. This year, we've run a deficit through the first 9 months, and this is the Treasury and the Federal Reserve's number, $1.4 trillion. I think we're on path to do $2 trillion. I called this last fiscal year. And why did I say that was going to happen? Because we had a CR. You're really not addressing the spending because the Congress does not want, through the appropriations process, get their arms around it. The reason McCarthy got turfed out is he cut a deal on the debt ceiling with Biden that took off any limits on the debt ceiling during Biden's illegitimate regime. That's not what you do with an illegitimate regime. You put the screws on them and tighten them down. The Republican Party embraced Biden as a legitimate winner because they want to be rid of Trump, just like they want to be rid of Trump now. And you see this through these phony confirmation hearings, and you see this in what's happening with the intelligence apparatus. But it doesn't get us away from the ultimate reality check. We are just burning through money. We don't have money anymore. And for the Defense Department, I love Pete, I love, General Kane, all these guys, but it's just not acceptable to come back and say, hey, look, we need a $350 billion reconciliation, and half of that's going to be to the military, and the other half we'll have to throw to social programs to get this through. Somebody's got to be a rational thinker here. So I've asked Phillip Patrick, come on, Phillip, and we had some good news this week on inflation, although it's not near the 2% target. But just as you see it, particularly vis-a-vis gold as a physical asset, just the overall mindset, because right now, I just don't see anybody putting a break. Every time Russ Vought tries to go up with a rescissions package, he's stored it. Now, I think he got a $10 billion package put forward the other day on some social spending of the Democrats. But that, when you're spending $7.5 trillion, I mean, the basic math is we're spending $7.5 trillion. We're bringing in $5.5 trillion. And I've told everybody, if you're out there and think President Trump wants to do away with the income tax, he does in the long term. That's aspirational. But right now, he's given Scott Bessent a mandate: get every penny everybody owes, because we need to close the gap between the 5.5 and the 7.5. Your thoughts, sir?
I mean, that's an understatement. Debt and deficit is the biggest problem that we're facing here in the United States. An administration that, really focused on getting a grip on it couldn't do it. And I think it shows you the problem now is structural. And sovereign debt's not simply an American problem. This is a problem now throughout the entire developed world. I mean, the economy is still growing globally, but it's not growing quickly enough to outrun the promises that governments have made around the globe. The IMF predicts, and this is frightening, 3% global economic growth this year, but at the same time, public debt now has risen to nearly 94% of the entire world economy. The IMF expects within 3 years that'll hit 100%, which means world governments are going to soon owe as much as the entire global economy produces in 12 months. And the worst part of all, and I think this is directly related to our position in the United States, these deficits are no longer sort of temporary emergency measures, right? The governments around the world, and the US government as well, we're borrowing during recessions, we're borrowing during recoveries, we're borrowing for entitlements, as you pointed out earlier, defense spending, all of it, and a large portion now, worst of all, is going to interest on the debt. Here in America, as you pointed out before, the CBO expects a 1.9, almost $2 trillion deficit this year. That's about 5.8% of GDP. Historically, that level of spending is associated with wars or very deep recessions. And today, it's becoming sort of ordinary government finance. And like I said at the beginning, this isn't just an American problem, but we are certainly leading the way. Europe is loosening fiscal policy to finance defense and infrastructure as well. But
we have our own problems at home. And like I said, we're leading the way. The problem is the solution to this longer term, right? There's only a handful of options. You mentioned one earlier, which is raising taxes. I don't think there's the political will to do it. And ultimately, tax rates would have to go to an obscene level to get a handle on deficit. There's spending cuts, which are proving politically problematic. There's default, which is not viable for us here in the United States. Or there's perhaps the most likely option, which is to allow inflation and financial repression to ultimately reduce the value of the debt longer term. Any one of those things politically is extremely painful. My fear is it's going to be the latter, right, which is financial repression. And what that does ultimately is punish savers it benefits borrowers. So it's a very problematic position we're in. And if the administration cannot get a handle on deficit spending, which, like I said, is proving increasingly difficult, we are going to see long-term devaluation of the dollar. We are going to see inflation being persistent longer term. And ultimately, I think we're going to see higher gold prices as a result.
Well, there's two things. There's number one, the studies done. You and I did every month, or at least every quarter during the illegitimate Biden regime, we would do about the rolling devaluation or the drop in purchasing price. I think we came up in that time at 22%. Jeffrey Tucker and others, in fact, I think that the founder of Grabian, or one of these video services, has sold his business, retired in Spain. He went back and did even more original analysis that shows that the true purchasing power dropped by 50%. I want to get to that in the next segment because I want to talk about the drop in purchasing power. But you mentioned deficits. One of the most respected economists, I think he's at Harvard, Kenneth Rogoff, wrote this book a few years ago called This Time It's Different. And he went through 800 years of financial history, went back the last 800 years across 66 countries. And every time where it hasn't tied directly to a cataclysmic conflict like World War II, which is quickly reversed because of explosive growth that happens at the end of that war, and that's only a few times, that every time, just in a essentially regular economy, you go above 100% of total debt to GDP, that you never reverse. In fact, it always ends in some sort of financial crisis. Can you give me a couple? I mean, Rogoff, this book, it's so scary. Your palms are sweating about a third of the way through it because he's just relentless and boom and giving you the stats. And he's telling you that, hey, this is almost a law of nature. This is as close to a finance having a natural law like the second law of thermodynamics, because we always talk, well, it's not the second law of thermodynamics. You can cut spending. But he says when you cross 100%, it's virtually no return, sir.
It's absolutely correct. And you're right. It's simple mathematics. When debt to GDP exceeds 100%, GDP, economic growth slows. The more you owe, ultimately, the less you make. And it's a trap. And you're right. It is absolutely frightening. The worst thing about it is that governments throughout history just make the same mistakes over and over again. And it's ultimately why monetary systems typically fail and typically return to gold. It's happened dozens and dozens of times in history. So, yeah, it's inexcusable given our knowledge of the past.
Let's take by the way, Birch Gold, we're going to talk to you about how you get to Phillip and the team. One of the ways, the simplest way is always take your phone and just text Bannon at 989898. They put you directly in touch with Phillip and his team, and you get access to the ultimate guide for investing in gold and precious metals today. Now, here's the beauty. There's no charge for any of this, and there's no obligation. In fact, we've argued for the last couple of years, and it's turned out to be the right argument when we first partnered with Birch Gold back in 2021, is let's get the most sophisticated. Let's take people who know very little about this. Let's teach them, right, about capital markets. Let's teach them about Bretton Woods. Let's teach them about why the dollar is the backbone of the global financial system. Let's talk about what happens when you have the decrease in the purchasing power of the dollar. What does it mean? What does it mean for your country? What does it mean for your community? What does it mean for you, individual consumer and a citizen? And this is why we have the smartest audience out there, and you have the biggest political impact. Okay, short commercial break. Phillip Patrick on the other side.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
There's also this controversy about public and non-public debt and all that. I think I just look at total debt. The way I think you must look at it is total debt, and then to the economy, and it starts to suppress growth. Because one of the theories, remember the theory of the case we had at the beginning is we were going to grow faster than we were adding. And we were doing that. Of course, things that like this war, when you start to have these type of things like these wars, that's an opportunity cost. That's going to impact growth. And now we're not growing at that pace, and the debt is increasing. And like I said, we had with everything else that's gone on, Philip, we had $1.4 trillion in the first 9 months with projections. And as we said at the beginning of the fiscal year, in late September last year and in the first of October, I said, look, I think it's going to be $2 trillion or close to it. And the reason is we're still working on CRs. We have not passed original spending. We haven't passed really appropriations since President Trump's been around. We're still dealing with, and you're going to get a CR, folks. Take your number 2 pencil out and write that down. You're going to get a CR because they haven't done the hard work on the appropriation side and had those fights, and Congress hasn't had the stones to sit there and go, hey, we have to have these cuts. The Democrats just want to spend and spend and spend, and the Republicans, particularly these hawks, and I'm a national security guy. Hell, I served 8 years as a naval officer, or 7.5, 8 years as a naval officer, in defense of my country, to be able to say, I believe in all this, but I don't believe of what is happening now because it's just too much. And we have to get a reality check. We're heading to a financial crisis. I also want to put it in to historical perspective. We, as you know, every day we had them yesterday, every day we try to have a hit on revolution, talking this great book that goes through the American Revolution. As you remember that clip we played from The Madness of King George, there's a scene where William Pitt the Younger, who has now become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, particularly towards the end of the Revolutionary War, he one of the reasons he became Prime Minister one of the reasons the war even started is that the books were not balanced. They had taken on so much debt fighting the French in the 100-Year War and then the 7-Year War, what we call the French and Indian War, that they had to figure out some way to pay for it. They just couldn't sell bonds. They couldn't keep borrowing from the same people they're borrowing for. The British people were highly taxed. They're going to be more taxed. They had to tax the colonies in all these different ways, and that led to the beginning of the revolution. The French, the only reason we won the revolution is the French stepped in because of their hatred, geopolitically, their hatred of the British, and they stepped in and they lent us money. Really just kind of had to sign for it. They lent us money. When it came time for them to, remember the guys at Versailles never paid attention to the books. When it came time that they had a problem shortly thereafter in the mid 1780s, when they had a problem, they then called everybody together because they had to start taxing the churches and they had to start taxing the people more. And that led to the French Revolution. It spun out of control. My point, world history is driven. What was the rise of Hitler? The rise of Hitler was the Weimar Republic balance sheet imploded, and they had hyperinflation where people were bringing wheelbarrows full of was it Deutschmarks at the time to buy a loaf of bread. It spun out of control. That when somebody came, just like Mussolini offered good order and discipline, when somebody came that could offer order, they said, "Hey, look, we'll overlook this guy's shortcomings to see what he's got to offer." So these types of situations start very early, that traditional politicians have a very tough time of getting their arms around them, but eventually the physics of money hits you. And when the physics of money hits you, there's at that time you're in a crisis and it gets very tough to turn. I have said on this show many, many times, and one of the reasons I'm so proud that we're partnered with Birch Gold to allow you to learn this yourself, because you have to learn it yourself, that the world right now has about $300 trillion in debt, all debt, from everything you can possibly count all the way up to sovereign debt. And on top of that, we have a highly leveraged bet as a nation on artificial intelligence and the potential productivity increases of artificial intelligence without mass layoffs. That's the implied bet of what we're doing in corporate America on top of what the government's already done with debt. We are going to have, the world is heading towards the world's biggest margin call, right? And when it has the world's biggest margin call, Katie barred the door, because the bastion of stability in the system from the Second World War that was set up was a dollar empire, was based upon the stability of the U.S. dollar. And what did that base that stability upon? The full faith and credit of the United States. And what is the full faith and credit of the United States? It's not the SEC. It's not the Security and Exchange Commission. It's not the Treasury Department. It's not the Federal Reserve. It's not the House of Representatives or the Senate. The executive branch is not the office of the president. It is the Grundoons. It is the working men and women in the United States of America. You are the full faith and credit. The whole world has checked you out. The world's an efficient market. And they've said since the cataclysm in the middle of the 20th century that left 200 million people dead and the whole world shattered, that, hey, these people are good people. They came in this fight when they didn't have to come in this fight. You know, they took the fight to Europe. They supplied all the arms and material. Their soldiers, sailors, and airmen had beyond courage and bravery. They stuck in, and they were in fights they didn't have to be in to get stability. These people are good and decent people. And yes, the entire system will be based upon their currency, because the credit of the world is essentially on their shoulders. Is that not where we stand, Philip Patrick? And now we're teetering over a potential abyss of a $300 trillion margin call globally, sir?
It's unavoidable. And I think any student of history, as you pointed out, masterfully understands at this point, it's almost inevitable. The Trump administration, as we discussed many times, had an almost impossible task heading into into the new administration. Biden had left them with such a colossal amount of debt, huge spending obligations, and ultimately a world that started to distrust our policies and ultimately our debt and our currency. It made the job very difficult. Fixing it through growth was always going to be a tough task. And I think the administration took many steps forward in doing that. However, as you mentioned, spending increased as well. Defense spending, tax revenues obviously reduced a little bit with tax cuts, which ultimately will pay dividends. But, until we can get a handle on debt and deficit, we've got a massive problem in front of us. And if you rightly point out, when empires in the past have gotten themselves into the position we are today, they haven't managed to get out of it. So, it's a very, very tough position. It isn't just domestically here. This is a global problem, but given that we are the global reserve currency, the lion's share of global transactions, the bulk of the world's assets sit here, we as a country have the most to lose. We've talked about end of the dollar empire, and obviously we're not hoping for it. We're hoping to prevent it. But yes, all of it ties together. At the end of the day, if the United States is running $2 trillion annual deficits and printing money to meet those deficits, it puts our reserve currency position under threat. As you mentioned, it's the full faith and credit, but it's also stability and accessibility, right? That has been key for our position to maintain as global reserve currency. And as long as you're printing $2 trillion annual deficits and you have previous administration seizing assets, those two things are now out the window. Couple that with consistent structural deficits, and I think we're heading very fast down a path that we don't want to be heading down.
I also want to talk. So you got President Trump and they're trying to do it. He tried to do it because he had this huge burden when he came in. But the alternative to him, and maybe we do part of this after this break, and I want to then talk about how people work with you guys to learn more, because that's what, if a informed consumer here, an informed investor is the best investor for physical gold right now. The alternative to President Trump is not reasoned austerity or just monetary logic. The alternative is, if you look at the Democratic Socialists who have all the energy, the Tea Party on the left or the populist left, if you actually look at their economic policies, if you actually look at what they are proposing from spending, they literally want to bring the system down because they have no controls whatsoever. What they're talking about in New York City is absolutely incredible. It's just crazy. What they're talking about in the rest of the country is absurd. On a national level, they are not simply open borders and not simply this transgender ideology. On everything culturally and everything that they're dealing with, are they the most radical? If you actually look at their economic plan, and if you look at their financial plan on top of that, they're the most radical at all. In fact, if you had to pick what would absolutely tilt the system into flying over the abyss, it would be as bad as Biden and these people were, right, for 4 years, which were out of control. Remember the $7.5 trillion? We said at the time, if you pass this stuff, you're going to kick off massive inflation. These people are even more radical. Okay, we're going to take a short break. We've got Phillip Patrick. He's going to tell you how you can work with the guys at Birch Gold who also opine on these Marxist jihadist Democratic associates. Birch Gold. Take your phone out and text Bannon, Bannon, at 989898. You get access right there. You get access to Phillip. Or you can go to birchgold.com/Bannon and get the End of the Dollar Empire. All the installments, there's a physical copy. You can get backordered on that. But all 7 that are in the physical copy are online free, plus an 8th, and we're working on a 9th right now. All of it free. Short break. Phillip Patrick on the other side.
Too many, I suppose.
No, sir.
Let me have it. Thank you. They lost at the time. It was India and North America, and they lost the United States in a revolution caused by a bunch of ministers coming up with a plan to say, "Hey, look, we got this debt problem. We can't possibly pay it down. We can't possibly pay the bondholders. Our people are taxed enough, maybe on the margin, but we have all kind of opportunities in the colonies to make those guys pay for what benefited them, the victory in the French and Indian War." Remember, these are the winners. These are the people that won. And what did it do? It caused them to make decisions that lost them the United States. You got to go back. You look at the arguments in Parliament at the time. They were as intense as any argument you heard of the Vietnam War. There were people at each other's throats saying, "Hey, look, what are we doing here? We're going to lose this fabulous." And it drove King George, although he had issues, it triggered the madness. Let me remind you on the French. The French won, having gotten their asses kicked by the British for decades and have driven out of North America and Canada. They actually won because they backed the right side in the revolution. They won. You know what it led to? It led to them all getting their heads cut off. When these things happen, look at the Weimar Republic. Look at the Weimar Republic. Look at what they bought into for the madness there. Look at the Italian people. Look what they bought into Mussolini. Look what they bought into Hitler. Look what they bought into, because in a time of financial crisis, it starts going so intensely that you had very brilliant people around the British crown. You had incredibly smart people around the throne, right? Some finance people came in there. You had smart people in Germany. Look what happened. Revolutions, wars, all of it. Why? The common denominator is finance. Phillip Patrick, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. Human beings are capable of such incredible good and such evil, and nothing can sort of lead to the latter more so than hunger and economic pain, right? People think that politics and economics are separate things, but they are so intrinsically tied, and I couldn't agree more. I'm getting very concerned about the direction that this country is heading, and as you mentioned before, this isn't a Trump thing, right? Trump is, I think, slowing at this point what looks like inevitable decline. The previous guys didn't have a clue what was going on and were spending like drunken sailors, but I think the new breed is far more dangerous, and I think they have an understanding of what's happening, but I just don't think they care. I think they're so politically motivated that they don't care about this country.
It's the Bolsheviks. I forgot to mention the Russian Revolution, about the war and how they were paying for the war. This is how the Bolsheviks, when economic times get very hard because of a balance sheet that's out of control and measures have to be put in, that's when you have these voices come up, and you saw with the Bolsheviks. That's exactly what you're seeing in New York. The affordability issue, which is just basically inflation and concomitantly the drop in purchasing power of the dollar. This is what we're here to teach you. So that when you look at New York City, it's not like, wow, I don't understand it. When you look at the American Revolution, you can kind of understand the context. When you look at the French Revolution, you can kind of understand the context, or the rise of Hitler, or World War II, or the Great Depression. We're trying to make sure that you have a frame of reference. So there's just not all random things happening. Why? Not so that you're a historian, so that in your own daily life, when you're hit with all this random stuff and you sit there and go, hang on a second, I think I kind of understand what's going on. And that's what we've done with the end of the dollar empire. We don't want the dollar empire to end. I do think there should be a national conversation about that, because by being the prime reserve currency, there are tremendous benefits, but there are also obligations, right? You're seeing part of that in the Persian Gulf right now, but the petrodollar. Phillip, how do people get to know you guys better and how they work with you? Because you've just been a great partner in explaining this to people over the years. I meet people all the time when we go to conferences, come up to me and say, hey, look, I put my money in gold at $1,100 when Phillip first started coming on. But they all say, look, I've learned so much, all the free information, you coming on a regular basis, a couple of times a week. It's really done a great benefit. But how do you work with people? How do they contact you? And what's the easiest way for them to work with your team?
It's very simple. First of all, I think you touched on a very important point that people today, and your audience certainly are, but they need to be more educated. But you pointed out sort of the Mamdani situation in New York. They're taking a real problem, but people need to understand the economics of their solutions are nonsensical. So I think being as informed as possible, as we tried to do, and I tried to do on, given the opportunity on your show, is so important. So very simple. It's birchgold.com/Bannon, or they can text Bannon to 989898, and that's going to get them access to a litany of free information, right? We've got End of the Dollar Empire reports. We've got a bunch of free installments there. We've got reports on how and why to buy gold under a Trump administration. That really ties into what's happening in the economy today. So again, birchgold.com/Bannon. If they are intrigued by what they read and want to learn more, then they can contact us. They're going to have access to myself and a lot of people like me that are there to answer questions, guide them through, and just make sure that people are informed and comfortable. So birchgold.com/Bannon. Just get the information and go from there.
Brother, thank you so much. And thank you for taking time on your Saturday to do this with us. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Steve. It's my honor.
Phillip Patrick. Terry Schilling. Do I have Schilling? I have my man Schilling. So, Terry, during the week, particularly this week, the last couple of weeks, the trial of the evidentiary trial of Charlie Kirk, and then rolling right into the intensity of the confirmation hearings, and particularly the revelations that have been put out about elections and foreign interference, all that. I want to make sure that we still get to the main issues that are the signals that are driving things, the debt being one. One aspect is that, and this ties in with Mark Wayne Mullins, everything that happened on what Biden did and the invasion and the stolen election, all of it. But and I want to put up your response to this article or this guy, that one of the core aspects of the Trump revolution is that the centerpiece of this revolution, not simply culturally or in a societal basis, but also economically. The unit of economics in a MAGA, in this populist nationalist outlook, is not the nation. We are economic nationalists, and that's highly important, but it's predicated upon a building block. And that building block is the American family. And we can't lose sight of that. There's many aspects of that, and I'm going to get into about the onslaught. But one of the simple facts we're talking about is that the family unit itself, how do we actually nurture it and grow it? And so I don't know if you call them these natalist policies or these policies just to make sure we have robust, good families that can then enjoy the fruits of a free economy and become the building block of that, has been under assault, right? As they're trying to go to the railhead of what the solution is. And if they feel as they can stop that, they can stop everything else. So that as a kind of framing, at least the way in my own simple Mick mind I look at it. Walk me through what happened this week and why we've been trying to get you on, sir.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. So there was an article written by a dear friend, longtime friend. I first met him when I first came to this town, John Tamney. And he was basically calling anyone concerned with the collapse in family formation and birth rates bedwetters. That's not his word. That's what I'm using for it. But he basically says that we're freaking out about nothing, that all of this stuff is going to solve itself, which is just frankly preposterous. He talks about how technology and artificial intelligence and how expanded supply chains will address all of the problems that we are going to suffer from having fewer and fewer people here. It's just not true, Steve. The reality is that you can have a strong economy, you can have high tech, you can have all of these things, but those are the whats. The real driver for our economy is the why, and the why is largely and almost infinitely the family. The reason that most young men start getting real jobs and real careers and working very hard is because they have a wife and they have children that they need to support. They have a home. We get bigger homes, we get bigger cars. We do these things to serve our families because our families are where we derive love. And I think, Steve, that this is the big picture that is aspirational, that is compelling, that's missing from every conservative wonk in Washington, D.C. They have the data, they have the stats, they have how this economic policy will impact these industries and these areas, but they don't have the compelling interests. No one just wakes up and says, I'm going to start a revolutionary business that changes the world. They kind of fall into that, and they do it because they're trying to provide for their family. Steve, I don't know how we get out of this. And I will draw a distinction between the natalists and the pro-family leaders. We want families. The natalists will throw anything at the wall. The natalists will invent artificial wombs. They will advance IVF. It's anything to solve the birth rate crisis. But the family-centered people, the people that want to grow our country and revive the American family, we're much more centered on God being the creator, God being the one that determines who lives and who dies and who is born and who is conceived. And I think it's very beautiful. Okay. It's important. Human beings are very bad at knowing how many people should be in the world, at knowing who should be in the world. There are lots of dystopian novels that have been written about men trying to make these calls, and they all turn into dystopias. But Steve, I just want to hit on something, because this AI fight, this high tech, all of this stuff, what it really is geared towards is it's making all of us subjects, not just subjects, but slaves. They're going to eliminate all of our jobs. They're going to eliminate all of the needs that we have. But what are we going to do? They're telling us that we're going to get universal basic income, that we won't have to worry about things. They'll be provided. How long until our masters, who are the ones in charge of AI and in charge of all the robotics, how long until they get tired of it? And how long will they put up with a bunch of people with tons of time on their hands? I think what is missing so much from the economic debates in this country is the why. The why is your family. The why is your wife. The why is your children. And if you don't have those things, you're not going to produce as much, and you're not going to be as passionate about producing those things because you don't have a why. If your why is just yourself, which is typically what happens when you don't have a family, you're going to have a bad time. You're not going to be as motivated. You're not going to reach as high as you can. You're not going to be feeling that hot fire under your ass, making sure that you're going the extra mile.
So I want you to stick with me. I'm going to come back. There's three basic elements we have to do. One is with John Tamny, who's a friend and a great guy, but what his thinking kind of represents and in the conservative movement. The second is this whole concept of the natalist versus the pro-family. And the third is this aspect of artificial intelligence. Terry Schilling, who is not just a thinker and thinking through all this, he's at the absolute front line of combating it and building something quite positive in its stead. Short commercial break. Back in the war room in a moment.
We rejoice when there's no more. Let's take down the CCP.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Okay, first I want to go back to Tammy. John Tammy is one of the smartest men in D.C. He runs Real Clear Markets. And I can't speak highly enough. When we talk about going to news sites and going to, Citizens Free Press with Citizen Kane, you got Hoft over at Gateway Pundit, you got Bowl at Breitbart, you got all these great sites, Raheem's National Pulse. It's incredible. We are so blessed by having such a Sean Davis and the team of the Federalists. I could go on and on and on. Daily Signal, Rob Bluey with his team. There's 20 great sites that provide great news. And Real Clear, the Real Clear team, whether it's Real Clear Investigations, Real Clear Politics, which is their flagship, and their other flagship is Real Clear Markets. He's the editor of Real Clear Markets. Now, and I helped him. In fact, I think we published or helped get published that last book he did. He is a hardcore Cato Institute libertarian, kind of almost anarcho libertarian when it comes to economics and culture and society. Tammy and I can say, and I consider him a friend and a colleague, we don't agree on anything. Nothing. We're at a point now we don't agree on anything. Nothing. So when I saw this, I got it right to Terry to go, this guy's insane. You got to respond. And you did a great tweet thread. But more importantly, is that John Tamny is a leading edge thinker for a big part and huge part of the conservative movement. And that is are people that are, number one, detest the populist nationalists, but even more than detesting the populist nationalists, I think they detest that part of the populist nationalists, which is the pro-family. They consider this just archaic thinking. And that's why I believe that even when we're in power, we have a very tough time pulling together a policy agenda. The left, I don't believe, has that. They're much more in unison. They fall in line about around the radical transgender ideology, virtually because they run like Stalinists. You're either with it or you're out. And then during elections, they all come out there and go, yes, we don't agree with men and women's sports, but of course they buy into it. On the right, we don't have that. So talk to me first. Give me a couple of minutes on that, on what your struggle is against that kind of mindset. And I would tell you this, I think it's actually a bigger mindset within conservative economic thinking than populist nationalism and far more than the pro-family as an economic unit, Terry Schilling.
Steve, that couldn't be more true. Our biggest enemies in reforming the American economy to be more centered on the American family is not leftists. Well, it is leftist, but for other reasons. It's the right. It's the conservatives. They hear these things and they brand it as if it's unfair for single and unmarried people to subsidize the lives and families of others. They didn't make that choice to get married and have children. Why should they have to subsidize it? The reality is, Steve, for the vast majority of American history, we had a pro-family tax code. We had a pro-family economy that benefited and actually recognized the sacrifices that families make so that they can produce the next generation of American citizens. But in the 60s and 70s, there was a huge shift. You had the rise of radical feminism, which said that the family, literally Betty Friedan said that the family is a comfortable concentration camp. And then you had the population control people people like Paul Ehrlich, who worked around the clock and around the globe to institute anti-family economic policies as well as anti-family cultural policies. Nixon was actually the first president to move forward with changing the tax code to level the playing field. Families had a beneficial tax code in the 60s and 70s. He wanted to change it so that single people had the same benefits. So once you start treating single and never married and the childless equally with those that are actually sacrificing and building a future and putting their money, I mean, Steve, you know as well as I do, these kids are expensive. It's a sacrifice we gladly take up, but it's also a calling from God. I didn't choose how many kids I had. I'm Catholic. I don't do that. My wife and I just are in love, and we take whatever kids God gives us. We are providing the next generation of American citizens. And I think that it's a struggle for the Tammany types. And again, I think you said it exactly right. Tammany is a brilliant man. He's very smart. He's on the edge. I mean, he's always on the cutting front of things. And that's why it was actually a little bit surprising to just see him oppose this and think we shouldn't need to do anything. We have to save the American family. It is the why for why our economy is working at all. But I think the bigger point that I was making is that family fills a serious gap in our country. And as the family has declined in America since the 1970s all the way up until today, we've been filling it more and more with leisure, with drugs, with counseling, with therapy. Americans have never been more depressed, more mentally ill, more afflictions, and less driven. And it's because our marriages are through the floor. Our average age of first marriage is into the 30s now. The birth rates are through the floor. We don't have a why. And these problems are going to keep getting worse. We're going to keep prescribing young men powerful pain-killing drugs. We're going to keep getting them addicted. We're going to keep having fentanyl deaths because they don't have a why. The why is why we get clean. It's why my dad got clean. I've been talking about this a lot, Steve. My dad was literally an alcoholic and a recovering crack addict. And he got cleaned when it was clear that it wasn't compatible with our family. When my mom filed for divorce, they saved their marriage, went on to have 6 more children. The family is the why. And I can't, Steve, it's like, how do these economist types in DC calculate the impact that holding your child for the first time will have on you? How do they calculate the impact on the GDP from when you kiss your baby girl for the first time, right? These things are immeasurable and they matter much more than the GDP. They're actually why so many men like myself and like you go to work every day. It's to provide for our families, to get grandkids so that we can have lives worth living. If you don't have a family, we're all part of a family, by the way. You don't have to have your own children right away, but you have to have a why. You have to have a motivation. And so I feel bad for the people that can only think in terms of dollars. Cardinal Sarah is a great African cardinal in the Catholic Church. He said that the point of life is not to manage your bank account. It is to love your family and to serve others. It's so beautiful, and that's what we should be striving for.
Hang here for 1 second. I just want to hold you for a minute. I want to talk about the family formation and artificial intelligence. Terry Schilling's with us. One Nation, the massive hit on the Billboard charts. Steve Gruber and his team are going to take us out. Michael Pack, the great filmmaker, is going to join us in our second hour.